So before we proceed with the definition of risk management, first we need to define what is risk. So according to Oxford Dictionary, risk is defined as the following: a chance or possibility of danger, loss, injury, or other adverse consequences. And the definition of at risk is exposed to danger. In this context, risk is used to signify negative consequences. However, taking a risk can also result in a positive outcome. A third possibility is that risk is related to uncertainty of outcome. Uncertainty outcome is that it is situations under which either the outcomes and or their probabilities of occurrences are unknown to the decision maker. So here, a negative result of risk are threats, and when it occurs, it becomes an issue or a big problem to the company. However, these can also result into positive rather, by providing an opportunity for your project and organization. Next one definition of risk is effect of uncertainty on objectives. Note that an effect may be positive, negative, or a deviation from the expected. Also, risk is often described by an event, a change in circumstances, or a consequence. This is according to ISO Guide 73. The next one is that from Institute of Risk Management, wherein risk is the combination of the probability of an event and its consequences can range from positive to negative. And then also, according to Orange Book from HM Treasury, uncertainty of outcome within a range of exposure arising from a combination of the impact and the probability of potential events. The next one is from Institute of Internal Auditors, wherein the uncertainty of an event occurring that could have an impact on that achievement of the objectives. Risk is measured in terms of consequences and likelihood. The last one is that from alternative definition by the author. It is event with the ability to impact, inhibit, enhance, or cause doubt about the mission, strategy, projects, routine operations, objectives, core processes, key dependencies, and or the delivery of stakeholder expectations. That is the definition of risk according to those researchers. There are usually three categories of risk. First is the hazard or pure risk. The second one is the control or uncertainty risk, and then the third one is opportunity or speculative risk. Here in hazard risk, this type of risk come from dangerous situations in a specific workplace or an organization in the or any part of the company. Some common examples include the chemical hazard caused by improper storage or use of flammable, poisonous, toxic or carcinogenic chemicals. Equipment hazard caused by faulty equipment or poor processes when using equipment such as machinery and so on and so forth. That is an example of hazard risk. The next one is the uncertainty risk. This type of risk is from uncertainty around unknown or unexpected events. It's hard to predict these events and the damage they can cause. It's also hard to control the damage once they occur. Examples of these are unex- examples of this in the business is that um, unexpected financial loss due to an economic downturn or bankruptcy of other businesses that owe you money, loss of important suppliers or customers, and also we can we can give example of this as the decrease in market share because new competitors or products enter the market. That is an example of uncertainty risk. And the third one is the opportunity risk. This type of risk comes from taking one opportunity over others by deciding to commit your resources to one opportunity you risk. Opportunity risk for a business, like for example, include moving a business to a different location or maybe buying a new property, selling a new product or a service. That is an example of an opportunity risk. Next is the importance of risk. First is operations will become more efficient because events that can cause disruption will be identified in advance and actions taken to reduce the likelihood of these events occurring, reducing the damage caused by these events and containing the cost of the events that can cause disruption to normal efficient production operations. We're in here in companies increasingly focus more on identifying risk and managing them before they even affect the business. Here, the ability to manage risk will help companies or other institutions act more confidently as much as possible. The next one is that processes will be more effective because consideration will have been given to selection of the processes and the risk involved in the alternatives that may be available. Also, processes changes that are delivered by way of projects will be more effectively and reliably delivered. Like for instance, a company will ensure that the processes are useful or still useful and still efficient for their company. The problem will be mitigated, identified ahead of time as much as possible. The last one is that strategy will be more efficacious in that the risk associated with different strategic options will be fully analyzed and better strategic decisions will be reached. Efficacious refers to the fact that the strategy rather that will be developed will be fully capable of delivering the required outcomes. So now let's proceed with the categories of disruption. Disruption is a major disturbance, something that changes the plans or interrupts some event or processes. Parang siya yung sagabal sa pagpapatupad ng isang bagay sa isang kumpanya or any other institutions. First is that people, wherein they have the lack of skills or resources, unexpected absence of key personnel, health, accident, or injury to people. The second one is premises, wherein the examples are inadequate or insufficient premises, denial of access to premises, damage to or contamination of premises. Those are the examples of disruption under the premises. And the third one is assets, wherein accidental damage to physical assets, breakdown of plant or equipment. Then the last one is theft or loss of physical assets. That that are the examples of disruption under the assets. And then the fourth one is suppliers, wherein disruption caused by failure of supplier, delivery of defective goods or components, failure of outsourced services and facilities. The next one is that information technology. It is where the example is that failure of IT hardware systems, disruption by hacker or computer virus, inefficient operation of computer software. And then the last one, but not the least, is the communications. Inadequate management of information, failure of internal or external communications, and the last one is transport failure or disruption. Those are the categories and examples of disruption. These are the definitions of risk management. According to ISO Guide 73, coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. And then the second one is from Institute of Risk Management, wherein process which aims to help organizations understand, evaluate, and take action on all their risks with a view to increasing the probability of success and reducing the likelihood of failure. And then the third one is from Treasury, wherein all the processes involved in identifying, assessing, and judging risk, assigning ownership, taking actions to mitigate or anticipate them, and monitoring and reviewing progress. And then, based on London School of Economics also, selection of those risks of a business or a business should take and those which should be avoided or mitigated, followed by action to avoid or reduce risk. And then the last one is that from Business Continuity Institute, wherein they said culture processes and structures that are put in place to effectively manage potential opportunities and adverse effects. Those are from different institutions where they provide some definitions of risk management.
Risk management. Risk management defined as the process of identifying the loss exposures and to monitor risk control and to minimize the negative impact they may have on organization and selects the most appropriate techniques for treating such exposures. A loss exposure is any situation or circumstance in which a loss is possible, regardless of whether a loss occurs. Loss exposure refers to someone or something that may be harmed, destroyed, vanish, or get ill due to another person's action or an unintentional event. A loss exposure is a possibility of loss. For example, a plant that may be damaged by an earthquake or an automobile that may be damaged in a collision. The objectives of risk management. The risk management has objective before and after loss occurs, the pre-loss and the post-loss objectives. The pre-loss objectives. Prepare for potential losses in the most economical way. Reduce anxiety. Since some loss exposures can cause catastrophic losses, such as major lawsuits, meet any legal obligations. Legal obligations must be met, including installing safety devices to protect workers. Post-loss objectives. Survival of the firm. This objective means preparing the company to continue operating through or shortly after a tremendous loss or incidents. Next is to continue operating. After a loss, it's very important for a company to have the reserve in order to continue operation. Stability of earnings or stabilized earnings. Companies that continue to operate through losses continue their earning per share potential. In some cases, a firm can endure more expense in order to maintain operation throughout the losses. Next is maintain growth. A company is able to maintain growth by continuing expansion at all costs. The last is to minimize the effect that a loss will have on other persons and on society. A served loss can have an effect on employees, suppliers, creditors, and the community in general. It is important to maintain a positive moral. The risk management process. The first one is identify loss exposure. Second is measure and analyze the loss exposure and select the appropriate combination of techniques for treating the loss exposures. The risk control and risk financing. Under the risk control is the avoidance, loss prevention, and loss reduction. And under the risk financing is the retention, non-insurance transfers, and insurance. And the final process of risk management is to implement and monitor the risk management program. Kinds of loss exposures: property, liability, business income, human resources, crime, employee benefit, foreign, intangible property, and failure to comply with government rules and regulations. Property loss exposure, a condition that presents the possibility that a person or an organization will sustain a loss resulting from damage to property in which that person or organization has a financial interest, including destruction, taking, or loss of use. Liability loss exposure, a condition that presents the possibility that a person or an organization will sustain a loss resulting from a claim made against that person or organization by someone seeking money damages or some other legal remedy. Business income loss exposures. This provides the coverage for lost income when a business is forced to close. Human resources loss exposures. It's a death or disability of key employees, retirement or unemployment, and injuries. Employee benefit loss exposures. Failure to comply with gov regulation, violation of fiduciary responsibilities, group life and health, and retirement plan exposure, and a failure to pay promised benefits. Foreign loss exposures, acts of terrorism, kidnapping of key personnel, political risks, and foreign currency risk. Intangible property loss exposures. It is a intangible property that is not real property. And to failure to comply with government rules and regulations. Risk managers have several sources of information to identify loss exposures. The risk analysis questionnaires and checklists, physical inspection, flowcharts, financial statements, and historical loss data. Risk analysis questionnaires and checklists is a technique that can be used to identify and manage risk. Physical inspection is a process of checking your asset against set criteria and the evaluation of all security systems and access controls. This helps you to prove compliance and to uncover any potential risks for your organization. Flow charts or workflows outline the specific and detailed activities or work steps that are required to carry out various processes within the risk management function. Financial statements. Financial statements help managers assess achievement or financial goals. And the historical loss data, an annualized average net charge-off rate incurred during a prescribed time period as a proxy for estimating future losses. Industry trends and market changes can create new loss exposures. For example, exposures to acts of terrorism. Measure and analyze loss exposures. Estimate for each type of loss exposure, the loss frequency and the loss severity. Loss frequency refers to the probable number of losses that may occur during some time period, and loss severity refers to the probable size of the losses that may occur. Rank exposure by importance. Loss severity is more important than loss frequency. The maximum possible loss is the worst loss that could happen to the firm during its lifetime, and the probable maximum loss is the worst loss that is likely to happen. Select the appropriate combination of techniques for treating the loss exposures. Risk control refers to techniques that reduce the frequency and severity of losses. Risk control also implements proactive changes to reduce risks in these areas. And the methods of risk control include avoidance, loss prevention, and loss reduction.
Select the appropriate combination of techniques for treating the loss exposures. Avoidance means certain loss exposure is never acquired or undertaken, or an existing loss exposure is abandoned. The chance of loss is reduced to zero. It is not always possible or practical to avoid all losses. We have a way of avoiding any danger. It's just like building houses in areas that are prone to flooding or landslides. The risk can be avoided by selecting or building projects near it. It is not possible that we can avoid the loss of assets or own risks that may occur. Loss prevention refers to measures that reduce the frequency of a particular loss. For example, installing safety features on hazardous products. It is important in a business. An organization implements something to avoid loss of income, property, and so on. For example, in a business, in order to avoid any of its losses and be successful, proper action is needed on employees, customers, and on individual business relationships. Loss reduction refers to measures that reduce the severity of a loss after it occurs. For example, installing an automatic sprinkler system. For example of this is guarding private areas to prevent theft and setting off evacuations for everyone. These are done to prevent loss of assets or emergence of risk. Kaya kailangan natin ng matapang na pag-iingat o pag-alerto dito. Risk financing refers to techniques that provide for the payment of losses after they occur. In risk financing, it is the determination to compensate an organization in a more efficient way. This is done to help a company to grow and reach its goals. We have methods in risk financing. Number 1, retention. Number 2, non-insurance transfers. Number 3, commercial insurance. So what is retention? Retention means that the firm retains part or all of the losses that can result from a given loss. So retention is on how does an organization manage its losses in a business. Retention is effectively used when no other method of treatment is available. The worst possible loss is not serious, and losses are highly predictable. The retention level is a dollar amount of losses that the firm will retain. There are several methods for paying retained losses of a risk manager. Number 1, current net income. Losses are treated as current expenses. Number 2, unfunded reserve. Losses are deducted from a bookkeeping account. Number 3, funded reserve. Losses are deducted from a liquid fund. And the last, credit line. Funds are borrowed to pay losses as they occur. A captive insurer is an insurer owned by a parent firm for the purpose of insuring the parent firm's loss exposures. A single parent captive is owned by only one parent, and a group captive is an insurer owned by several parents.
Risk financing methods of retention. Risk financing is focuses on methods for paying for losses, which is necessary because not all losses can be prevented. It is also accomplished by retaining the risk, and for some risks, some or most of the cost of potential losses is transferred to third parties, usually insurance companies. It is also the practice of setting up a self-insurance reserve fund to pay for losses as they occur, rather than shifting the risk to an insurer or using hedging instruments. And it is also the assumption of risk of losses or damages. When a business retains risk, they absorb it themselves, as opposed to transferring it to an insurer. Self-insurance or self-funding. Self-insurance is called a self-funded plan. This is a type of plan in which an employer takes on most or all of the cost of benefit claims. The insurance company manages the payments, but the employer is the one who pays the claims. A risk retention group. It is a group captive that can write any type of liability coverage except employer's liability, workers' compensation, and personal lines. They are exempt from many state insurance laws. Risk retention is handling the unavoidable or unavoided risk internally, either because insurance cannot be purchased or it is too expensive for the risk, or because it is too much more cost effective to handle the risk internally. An insurance deductible is a common example of risk retention to save money, since a deductible is a limited risk that can save money on insurance premiums for larger risks. There are also advantages and disadvantages of retention. First, save on loss costs, save on expenses, encourage loss prevention, and increase cash flow. Disadvantages: possible higher losses, possible higher expenses, and possible higher taxes. Risk financing methods of non-insurance transfers. Non-insurance transfer is a method other than insurance by which a pure risk and its potential financial consequences are transferred to another party. Examples include contracts, leases, hold harmless agreements. Non-insurance transfer of risks through contract is often accomplished or prevented by a hold harmless clause, which may limit liability for the party to which the clause applies. It is also the transfer of risk from one person or entity to another by way of something other than a policy of insurance. There are also advantages and disadvantages of non-insurance transfers. The advantages are: can transfer some losses that are not insurable, less expensive, and can transfer loss to someone who is in a better position to control losses. The disadvantages are: contract language may be ambiguous, so transfer may fail. If the other party fails to pay, firm is still responsible for the loss. and insurers may not give credit for transfers. Risk financing methods of insurance. Insurance is appropriate for low probability, high severity loss exposures. The risk manager selects the coverages needed and policy provisions. A deductible is a specified amount subtracted from the loss payment otherwise payable to the insured. In an excess insurance policy, the insurer pays only if the actual loss exceeds the amount a firm has decided to retain. The risk manager selects the insurer or insurers to provide the coverages. The manager negotiates the terms of the insurance contract. A manuscript policy is a policy specially tailored for the firm. The parties must agree on the contract provisions, endorsement forms, and premiums. Information concerning insurance coverages must be disseminated to others in the firm, and the risk manager must periodically review the insurance program. Insurance is another method that most people, businesses, and other organizations can use to transfer pure risks by paying a premium to an insurance company in exchange for a payment of a possible large loss. For example, if the contents of my house are insured and there is a flood causing $10,000 worth of damage, I will be paid $10,000 to either replace or repair the items that were damaged. Because an insurance company can pay for losses because it pools and invests the premiums of many subscribers to pay the few who will have significant losses. And here is the exhibit risk management matrix. Type of loss. Number 1, loss frequency is low. Loss severity is low. Approximate risk management technique is retention. Number 2, loss frequency is high and its loss severity is low. Approximate risk management technique, loss prevention and retention. Number 3, loss frequency is low. Loss severity high. Approximate risk management technique, transfer. Number 4, loss frequency is high. Loss severity is high. And the approximate risk management technique is avoidance.
Market conditions and the selection of risk management techniques. Risk management may have to modify their choice of techniques depending on market conditions in the insurance of markets. You can choose here your techniques by using this. Next is implement and monitor the risk management program. There is the word implement and you will be risk management policy statement. One of the example is education top level executives. And another is management manual, which is train new employees. Another is implement and monitor the risk management program. Successful risk management program requires active cooperation from the other partners in the firm. Benefits of risk management. You can also have a benefits from risk management where these are society, because both direct and indirect losses and reduce. Next is personal risk management. This refers to the identification of your risks faced by individual or family. This may be also applied in corporate risk management. What is the risk management process? The risk management process consists of a series of steps that were undertaken in sequence, enable continual improvement in decisions making. These are the steps of risk management process. Step 1, communicate and consult. Step 2. Establish the context. Step 3. Identify the risk. Step 4. Analyze the risk. Step 5. Evaluate the risk. Step 6. Treat the risk. And the last is monitor and review.
There are 7 steps in risk management process. Step 1. Communicate and consult. Communication and consultation aims to identify who should be involved in assessment of risk, including identification, analysis, and evaluation, and it should engage those who will be involved in the treatment, monitoring, and review of risk. Good communication and consultation is essential for risk management and attempts to improve people's understanding of risk and the risk management processes, ensure all relevant stakeholders are heard, ensure that everyone is clear on their roles and responsibilities. As such, communication and consultation will be reflected in each step of the process described here. As an initial step, there are 2 main aspects that should be identified in order to establish the requirement for the remainder of the process. These are communication and consultation aimed at eliciting risk information. Communication and consultation may occur within the organization or between the organization and its stakeholders. It is very rare that only one person will hold all the information needed to identify the risk to a business or even to an activity or project. It therefore important to identify the range of stakeholders who will assist in making this information complete. It is a proven way of identifying and assessing factors that could negatively affect the success of a business or project. Managing stakeholder perception for management of risk. Internal stakeholders are people whose interest in a company comes through a direct relationship such as employment, ownership, or investment. External stakeholders are those who do not directly work with a company but affected somehow by the actions and outcomes of the business. Tips for effective communication and consultation. Determine the outset whether a communication strategy and or plan is required. Determine the best method or media for communication and consultation. The significance or complexity of the issue or activity in a question can be used as a guide as to how much communication and consultation is required. The more complex and significant to the organization, the more detailed and comprehensive the requirement. Communication and consultation is important because stakeholders also make their judgments about risk based on their own perception, which could be identified, recorded, and integrated into the decision-making process. Step 2. Establish the context. Provide a 5-step process to assist with establishing the context within which risk will be identified. 1. Establish the internal context. 2. Establish the external context. 3. Establish the risk management context. 4. Develop risk criteria. Last, define the structure for risk analysis. Establish the internal context. As previously discussed, risk is the chance of something happening that will impact on objectives. As such, the objectives and goals of a business, project, or activity must first be identified to ensure that all significant risks are understood. This ensures that risk decisions always support the broader goals and objectives of the business. This approach encourages long-term and strategic thinking. The internal context is the internal environment in which the firm functions and seeks to achieve its objectives. In establishing the internal context, the business owner may also ask themselves the following question. Is there an internal culture that needs to be considered? For example, are staff resistant to change? Is there a professional culture that might create unnecessary risk for the business? What staff groups are present? What capabilities does the business have in terms of people, system, processes, equipment, and other resources?
Establish the external context. This step defines the overall environment in which a business operates and includes an understanding of the client's or customer's perceptions of the business. An analysis of these factors will identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the business in the external environment.
The external context also, it is the given environment in which the firm operates and seeks to achieve its objectives. Consideration should be given to the following inputs as they relate to the business, social, regulatory, legislative, cultural, competitive, financial, and political environment, including relationships with perceptions and values, external stakeholders such as clients. A business owner may ask the following questions when determining the external context. These are the: what regulations and legislation must the business comply with? Are there any other requirements the business needs to comply with? What is the market within which the business operates? Who are the competitors? Are there any social, cultural, or political issues that need to be considered? Tips for establishing internal and external context. The first one is determine the significance of the activity in achieving the organization's goals and objectives. The second one is define the operating environment. And the last one is identify internal and external stakeholders and determine their involvement in the risk management process. These tips is important because it is the ability to explain the organization's context, aids a company in correctly aligning its risk management strategy with its overall risk appetite and tolerance in order to obtain a competitive advantage without jeopardizing business continuity. The third one is establish the risk management context. Before beginning a risk identification exercise, it is important to define the limits, objectives, and scope of the activity or issue under examination. For example, in conducting a risk analysis for a new project, such as the introduction of a new piece of equipment or a new product line, it is important to clearly identify the parameters for this activity to ensure that all significant risks are identified. The selection of key objectives within the business should be driven by an evaluation of the external and internal factors that may currently impact the firm. A review of both the external and internal context at the commencement of the risk assessment planning assists in identifying the processes which may be subject to increased risk and as such would derive the greatest value from the risk assessment. Tips for establishing the risk management context. The first one is define the objectives of the activity, task, or function. The second one is identify any legislation, regulations, policies, standards, and operating procedures that need to be complied with. The third one is decide on the depth of analysis required and allocate resources accordingly. And the last one is decide what the output of the process will be: a risk assessment, job safety analysis, or a board presentation. The output will determine the most appropriate structure and type of documentation. These tips is important because it is establishing the context, define the scope for the risk management process, and sets the criteria against which the risk will be assessed. The scope should be determined within the context of the firm's organizational objectives. Risks are uncertainties that affect the achievement of business objectives, so risk cannot be fully identified if these objectives and strategies are unclear. The fourth one is develop risk criteria. Risk criteria allow a business to clearly define unacceptable levels of risk. Conversely, Risk criteria may include the acceptable level of risk for a specific activity or event. In this step, the risk criteria may be broadly defined and then further refined later in the risk management process. These criteria also establish the threshold at which a risk is acceptable or tolerated. The criteria are used to decide if the risks are acceptable, unacceptable, or need to be decreased to a level that is reasonably achievable throughout the decision-making process. Tips for developing risk criteria. Decide or define the acceptable level of risk for each activity. Determine what is unacceptable. And the last one, clearly identify who is responsible for accepting risk and at what level. Number 5, it is the define the structure for risk analysis. Isolate the categories of risk that you want to manage. This will provide greater depth and accuracy in identifying significant risks. The chosen structure for risk analysis will depend upon the type of activity or issue, its complexity, and the context of the risk. It is also to conduct a risk assessment to identify hazards related with food safety. It is also to create and implement ways to minimize or decrease the hazards of contaminated food. Risk analysis is risk communication, which involves informing people about the dangers and management techniques related with food safety.
And now, we are moved on to the step 3, which is the identify risk. Risk cannot be managed unless it is the first identified. Once the context of the business has been defined, the next step is to utilize the information to identify as many risks as possible. Risk identification is also the process of determining risks that could potentially prevent the program, enterprise, or investment from achieving its objectives, and includes documenting and communicating the concerns. The aim of risk identification is to identify the possible risks that may affect either negativity or positivity. And this would be answering the following question identifies the risk, which is what can happen, how can it happen, and why could it happen. There are two main ways to identify a risk. The first is identifying retrospective risks. Retrospective risks are those that have previously occurred, such as incidents or accidents. Retrospective risk identification is often the most common way to identify a risk and the easiest. It's easier to believe something it has happened before, and it's also easier to quantify its impact to see the damage it has caused. In other words, retrospective risk look backwards and examines exposures to suspect risks or protection factors in relation to an outcome that is established at the start of the study. There are many sources of information about retrospective risk, and this includes hazard or incident logs or registers, audit reports, customer complaints, accreditation document and reports, past staff and or client surveys, newspaper or professional media such as journal and websites. The second main to identify risk is identifying prospective risks. Prospective risks are often harder to identify. These are things that have not yet happen, but it might happen sometime in the future. Identification should include all risks, whether or not they are currently being managed. The rationale here is to record all significant risks and monitor or review the effectiveness of their control. In other words, prospective risk management has been defined as the set of measures, either structural or non-structural, which is established by a community or a local government. These are the methods for identifying prospective risks. The first is the brainstorming with staff or external stakeholders, researching the economy, political, legislative, and operating environment, conduct interviews with relevant people and or any organizations, undertaking surveys of staff or clients to identify anticipated issues or problems, flow charting a process, reviewing system design or preparing system analysis techniques. These are the tips for effective risk identification. The first is select a risk identification methodology appropriate to the type of risk and the nature of the activity. Involve the right people in risk identification activities. Take a cycle approach to risk identification and determine how risks change and evolve throughout this cycle.
Step 4. Analyze the risk. During the risk identification step, a business owner may have identified many risks, and it is often not possible to try to address all those identified. The risk analysis step will assist in determining which risks have a greater consequence or impact than others. Risk analysis. Risk analysis is knowing the possible success or failure any endeavor and planning for fallback position or next option to come up with better result or outcome. Risk equals consequence times likelihood. Consequence is the environmental impact if an event occurs. Likelihood is the occurrence of an impact that affects the environment. Once you enter into a business, you are already taking the risk. Likewise, you are also taking the opportunity to gain profit. In business, you determine the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. These are the key factors that helps company grow or make a development. And also, it could help formulate strategies that will contribute to the success of a business. Elements of risk analysis: identifying existing strategies and controls that act to minimize negative risks and enhance opportunities. Determine the consequences of a negative impact or an opportunity. This may be positive or negative. Third, determine the likelihood of a negative consequence or an opportunity. Fourth, estimate the level of the risk by combining consequence and likelihood. Fifth, consider and identify any uncertainties in the estimates. There are three types of analysis, which are qualitative, semi-quantitative, and quantitative. The most common type of risk analysis is the qualitative method. Qualitative method involves identifying opportunities and threats, how likely they are to happen, and the potential impacts they do. The type of analysis chosen will be based upon the area of risk being analyzed. Tips for effective risk analysis. Risk analysis is usually done in the context of existing controls. The risk analysis methodology selected should, where possible, be comparable to the significance and complexity of the risk being analyzed. The higher the potential consequence, the more rigorous the methodology. Risk analysis tools are designed to help rank or prioritize risks. To do this, they must be designed for the specific context and the risk dimension under analysis. Step 5. Evaluate the risk. Evaluating the risk It is pinpointing the level of the risk that needs a quick response or treatment. Risk acceptance. It is the overall risk that don't already need any treatments, that the only option is acceptance, like for example, loss of resources. Step 6. Treat the risk. Risk treatment is about considering options for treating risks that were not considering acceptable or tolerable at steps. Risk treatment involves identifying options for treating or controlling risk in order to either reduce or eliminate negative consequences or to reduce the likelihood of an adverse occurrence. Risk treatment should also aim to enhance positive outcomes. Options for risk treatment. First, avoid the risk. Second, change the likelihood of the occurrence. Third, change the consequences. Fourth, share the risk.
Tips for implementing risk treatment. The key to managing risk is implementing effective treatment option. Ito ay pamamahala ng panganib ay sa pagpapatupad. Step 7 of Monitor and Review. Monitor and review is an essential and integral step in the risk management process. A business owner must monitor risk and review the effectiveness and management system that have been set up to effectively manage risk. Risks need to be monitored periodically to ensure changing circumstances. Do not alter the risk priorities. Very few risks will remain static. Therefore, the risk management process needs to be regularly repeated so that new risks are captured in the process and effectively managed. A risk management plan at a business level should be reviewed at least on an annual basis. An effective way to ensure that this occurs is to combine risk planning of risk review with annual business planning. Summary of risk management step. Ang summary of risk management step ay ang proseso ng pamamahala sa peligro ay isang balangkas para sa mga aksyon na kailangang gawin. Risk assessment principle. Legal background. Management Regulation 1999 are the umbrella regulation. Require employer to identify hazard, assess risk, eliminate or control exposure to risk, write it down if significant. The term umbrella used to cover a broad number of a function or items that all fall under a single common category. There are 5 steps of risk assessment. Number 1. What are the hazards? Anything that may cause harm. Number 2. Who is doing what, where, and when, and who else might be affected by what is done. For example, faulty wiring may cause fire and all the employees' management staff will be affected. Number 3. What is the degree of risk? High risk. Number 4. What do we need to or can we do to control, eliminate, or minimize exposure to the risk? Ito po ay secure necessary permits approved by electrical engineer and have the necessary equipment such as fire extinguisher in a certain place. Number 5. How will we monitor the work or people? Make it sure that their workplace are free from hazard on they are not at risk. The people, particularly the employees, management staff, are doing their work job comfortable and safe. What comes first? Even before the 5-step 1 question, what is it we would like to do? We can call this the task, the job to do, and the last is procedure. Everything can be covered in this way. Ang masasabi ko lang is such a very important to do first in planning everything we do. We need to an advanced planning to anything we intended to achieve for its assurance or fulfilling it. A concrete example of putting a business, it is very essential that we plan first. The location, the target market, source of income or capital, and so on, before finally making it into a reality, your own ideal business. Hazard and risk. Hazard, the potential to cause harm or damage. Risk, the chance of the
harm occurring, calculated as potential severity of a harm, the consequence or damage, and likelihood of event occurring. Overall, a hazard is something that can cause harm and a risk. Is the chance high or low that any hazard will actually cause somebody harm? So, these two are both affected the management of one's business. Thus, monitoring and review of it are essential for obtaining good and quality management in a certain company.
Hazard identification. Hazard identification is part of the process used to evaluate if any particular situation, item, thing, or etc. may have the potential to cause harm. Here are some questions when you are engaging hazard. First, what will I be using or doing? You must use the proper item for the specific work or thing you do. Second, how much do I know about what I'm using or doing? You must search how to use what you are using. And the last, what factors or properties could there be affect the level of hazard? Do I really have to do the work task at all? Can I substitute something less hazardous? Who is affected by the work? Those who do the work with maturity, experience, health and immune status, medication, disability, pregnancy. Others in the workplace, cleaning and maintenance staff, visitors, external, including neighbors. Consequence or severity. Severity describes the highest level of damage possibly when an accident occurs from a particular hazard. Questions that include severity is what could go wrong, what is the worst that could happen. Likelihood. Likelihood is how likely an accident it is that someone will come to harm. And questions are how often must it be done? How many people do it? Is everyone doing it competent and trained? In evaluating the risk of livelihood, there is highly unlikely, possibly, quite likely, very likely. And in severity, there is slight harm, injury affecting work, serious injury, and possibly fatality. We have here the risk matrix of severity and likelihood. In the first table, we can see that 16 to 4 is unacceptable to tolerable. In the second table, we can see 9 to 6, which is significant to tolerable, and 9 to 4 with the same significant to tolerable.
So now before I proceed with the table of risk matrix, I would just like to add some informations wherein what is the importance of risk matrix in an assessment. Risk matrix is used during risk assessment to define the level of risk by considering the category of probability or likelihood against the category of consequence severity. It is a simple mechanism to increase visibility of risk and assist management decision making. And then now we will proceed now to the table wherein we can see there the tolerable, significant, unacceptable, and insignificant. Unacceptable is a stop doing it until improvements made. So it is red where combinations of severity and likelihood cause risk to fall into the red area. The risk would be assessed as unacceptable and further work would be required to design an intervention to eliminate that associated hazard or to control the factors that lead to higher risk, likelihood, or severity. An example of this is that the racing driver where they want to win, or a racing driver wants to win in a race. A racing driver can gain time and possibly win a race by going quicker through the corners, drive faster, and brake later. However, these are the risks the driver takes in order to maximize his objective of winning a race. As a matter of fact, by doing so, the driver also increases the likelihood of a crash and also the level of the consequences when this happens. So every driver will try to eliminate or discover or determine its personal risk criteria depending on the car and circumstances at a given point. As such, they try to maximize their result, aiming to stay just below the unacceptable level of risk of having a crash, destroying the car, and getting injured. That's the example of unacceptable level. And then the second one is significant level, wherein proceed with caution but improvement high priority. An example of this is that a significant inventory of precious metals or gems. This might be a significant risk in an audit of a jewelry business. In other businesses, such risk may arise due to unique transactions, adjustment, or maybe critical accruals, such as the estimation of highly subjective allowances. That is an example of a significant level of risk. And the third one is the tolerable. Tolerable is okay to proceed but plan to improve. It is a maximum value of the risk which can be tolerated for the structure to be protected. Also, this tolerable risk is referred to as acceptable risk, being the maximum value of risk acceptable based on community expectations. The example of this one is that a bicycle manufacturer. A bicycle manufacturer depends on a single supplier for tires. Without a supply of these tires, production will cease and revenue will decline. The probability of a major supply disruption is forecast to be 0.6% per annum. The management of the company decide to accept this risk. That is an example of tolerable risk level. And then the fourth one or the last one is the I know. In addition for the tolerable pala, it is um this should be mitigated as best as possible so that it will not go worst. So the last one is the insignificant level of risk. It is any improvements low priority. Or we can say it has no harm or there's only minimal effects of it. That is the last level of the risk in the risk matrix on the table. Now we will move on into the decide measures to be taken. Here, if you decide measures to be taken, you should identify or document processes and also maintain a risk control and controls frameworks. And also, maybe you can also schedule internal controls and keeping track of current and past controls and their results in order to decide measures to be taken. And the next one is that implement them according to priority. Once hazard prevention and control measures have been identified, then it is where they should be implemented according to hazard control plan. Wherein they will implement hazard control measures according to the priorities established in the hazard hazard control measures that they have they have they have done or they have planned. And then the third one is to confirm measures appropriate and work. So to ensure that control measures are and remain effective, they should track progress in implementing controls, inspect and maybe evaluate controls once they are already done or install and follow routine preventive maintenance practices. That is how will they confirm measures appropriate and work. Next is monitoring and review. Under monitoring, they will monitor live nature of assessments. It is where they will analyze and learn lessons from risk events such as changes, failures, and so on and so forth from the nature of assessments. And then the second one is they will monitor the possible modification to procedures. It is where they will check if there are changes into the procedures or processes being presented before. And then under review, they will review or identifies changes to procedures. This is where they will detect the changes into the procedures or processes in order to monitor and still improve processes in an organization. The last one is the possible modification to assessment. The overall purpose of the risk review and regular monitoring is that to ensure relevance of risk management treatment as well as progress made in the treatment plan. Or in simpler words, we can say that this must occur to see whether the measures implemented have reduced risk effectively and whether more needs to be done. So now let's move on to the definition of internal control. What is an internal control? An internal control is an interlocking set of activities that are layered onto the normal operating procedures of an organization with the intent of safeguarding assets, minimizing errors, and ensuring that operations are conducted in an approved manner. Another way of looking at internal control is that these activities are needed to mitigate the amount and types of risk. So if we say risk, we define this as the possibility of something bad might happen to which a firm is subjected. Controls are also useful for consistently producing reliable financial statements. Financial statements are those who are written records that convey the business activities and the financial performance of a specific company or a specific business. So now, the second one is that it comes at a price, which is that control activities frequently slow down the natural process flow of a business, which can reduce its overall efficiency. Consequently, the development of a system of internal control requires management to balance risk reduction with efficiency. Usually, this process can sometimes result in management accepting a certain amount of risk in order to create a strategic profile that allows a company or a business to compete more effectively, even if it suffers occasional losses or many problems because controls have been deliberately reduced. The next one is that a system of internal controls tends to increase in comprehensiveness as a firm increases in size. Actually, this is needed because why the original founders did not have the time to maintain complete oversight when there are many established employees, rather, or locations. When a company goes public, when we say goes public, businesses usually go public to raise capital in hopes of expanding or emerging their business or company. There are additional financial control requirements that must be implemented, especially if the firm's shares are to be listed for sale on a exchange rather. Thus, the cost of controls tends to increase with size. If we say stock exchange, this is usually a marketplace where financial securities issued by companies are bought and sold. So if we try to think, there's no difference between the risk management and control or internal control rather, because both of them perform regular assessments to ensure appropriate reporting, risk management, integrity, ethical business conduct, and compliance with laws and regulations and processes. But if we try to compare both of them, risk management is actually a non-routine, and it evolves on thinking, and it uses fleet charge. Also, it answers the question what could happen, while internal control is a routine, a clerical, a set of procedures, and business as usual processes or an accounting, and it answers the question what could go wrong. That is that difference between the two. So in simpler words, internal control is a procedure or policy put in place by management to safeguard assets, promote accountability, increase efficiency, and stop fraudulent behavior. In other words, an internal control is a process put in place to prevent employees from stealing assets or committing fraud.
Internal control types. Internal control comes in many forms, which include the following. First ay ang Board of Directors. A Board of Directors is essentially a panel of people who are elected to represent shareholders. Responsibilidad niyang tingnan ang buong organization and provide governance over the management team. Second, internal auditors. Internal auditors routinely examine all processes, looking for failings that can be corrected with either new controls or tweaks of existing controls. Third, processes are altered so that more than one person is involved in each other. This is done so that people can cross-check each other, reducing fraud incidents and the likelihood of errors. Actually, fraud is a false representation of the facts, resulting in the object of the fraud receiving an injury by acting upon the misrepresented facts. Fourth, ang pag-access ng computer records ay restricted, so that information is only made available to those people who need it to conduct a specific task, upang maiwasan ang pagnakaw ng impormasyon at assets through the modification of ownership records. Lastly, assets are locked up when not in use, to make it more difficult to steal them. A key concept is that even the most comprehensive system of internal control will not entirely eliminate the risk of fraud or error. There will always be a few incidents, typically due to the unforeseen circumstances or an exceedingly determined effort by someone who wants to commit fraud. An effective system of internal control protects your plan in two ways. Una na dito yung pag-iwas na magkaroon ng errors or fraud kasi pwede itong ikasira ng plano. Dito na nagagamit yung preventive controls,
which are designed to discourage errors or fraud. Pangalawa, dapat madiskubre natin yung small errors bago ito maging malaking problema. Dito naman nagagamit ang detective controls. Detective controls are designed to identify an error or fraud after it has occurred. Preventive versus detective controls. Internal controls are typically comprised of control activities such as authorization, documentation, reconciliation, security, separation of duties, and they are broadly divided into preventive and detective activities. Always remember na ang preventive controls are designed to prevent errors, inaccuracy, or fraud before it occurs, while ang detective controls are intended to uncover the existence of errors, inaccuracies, or fraud that has already occurred. Here are the definition of preventive and detective controls. Preventive control activities aim to determine errors or fraud from happening in the first place and include thorough documentation and authorization practices. And the separation of duties ensures that no single individual is in a position to authorize, record, and be in a custody of a financial transaction and the resulting asset. Authorization of invoices and verification of expenses are internal controls. In addition, preventive internal controls include limiting physical access to equipment, inventory, cash, and other assets. An asset is a resource with economic value that an individual or corporation owns or controls with the expectation that it will provide a future benefit. Detective controls are backup procedures that are designed to catch items or events that have been missed by the first line of defense. Here, the most important activity is reconciliation, used to compare data sets, and corrective action is taken upon material differences. Other detective controls include external audits from accounting firms and internal audits of assets such as inventory. So what is inventory? Inventory is the accounting of items, components, parts, and raw materials a company uses in production or sales. Disadvantages of internal controls. Regardless of the policies and procedures established by an organization, only reasonable assurance may be provided that internal controls are effective and financial information is correct. The effectiveness of internal controls is limited by human judgment. A business will often give high-level personnel the ability to override internal controls for operational efficiency reasons, and internal controls can be circumvented through collusion.